Good evening and welcome to the second event in our series, Uplifting the Voices of Donor-Conceived People with LGBTQ Parents. My name is Jordan Budd. I use he and him pronouns, and I'm the executive director of COLAGE. As you may know, COLAGE is the only national organization expressly dedicated to the empowerment of people with LGBTQ parents or caregivers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that today begins the beginnings of Black History Month, just a few days removed from the release of the horrific video of Tyree Nichols' murder. As an abolitionist organization, we don't believe it is enough to just say Black Lives Matter. As a society, we must address the epidemic of police violence. I would encourage everyone listening tonight or in the future to read We Do This Till We Free Us by Miriam Kaba, which has helped COLAGE immensely in developing our own transformative justice framework. I also wanted to share a few housekeeping notes. We are recording this webinar. Captions are available for those who would like them. Choose the option on your screen to turn them on. And if you have questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as possible during our Q&A section. So let's get going with the topic at hand. Donor conception and the experiences of donor-conceived people continue to make headlines. As we consider legislation that seeks to improve the lives and outcomes of donor-conceived people, the voices of people with LGBTQ parents are central to these conversations to enrich the discussion and to avoid potential negative outcomes for LGBTQ families. At our last event, we heard from several donor-conceived queer spawn, a term many in our community use to convey that they have one or more LGBTQ parents, who grew up with known gamete donors. Tonight, we're going to hear from donor-conceived queer spawn who were conceived using an anonymous gamete donor. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers. First, Kennedy Barber-Fraser, she, her, is a first-year associate at a big law firm in New York, New York. She works in the litigation department, handling a variety of legal matters, including pro bono cases. She holds a BA from Smith College in history with a minor in Africana studies. She recently graduated from Boston University School of Law with a JD in May 2022. While at Boston University School of Law, she served as the editor-in-chief of the Boston University Public Interest Law Journal, president of the Women of Color Collaborative, historian and public relations coordinator for the Black Law Students Association, and a student attorney for the Immigrant Rights and Human Trafficking Program, as well as a research assistant. She also served as a judicial intern for the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. Kennedy has two moms, has participated in COLAGE's Family Week programming each summer from 5th to 12th grade, and previously served as a COLAGE facilitator in training and as a COLAGE counselor. Next up, Jamie Bergeron, she, her, is an experienced DEI practitioner and consultant. She regularly trains and consults with nonprofit organizations, corporate teams, and university groups dedicated to expanding their commitment to equity, inclusion, and social justice. A longtime social justice advocate and educator, she spent over a decade working specifically to support institutional change efforts in the university setting. Now, Jamie lends her expertise to teams seeking to create more inclusive organizations to serve their respective missions. Jamie was honored by Business Equality Magazine as a 2022 40 Under 40 LGBTQ+ honoree. She is also a certified HR professional with Society for Human Resources and Professionals and trained as a Title IX investigator for sexual misconduct. Jamie serves as board advisor for COLAGE and works with GLAAD, Massachusetts LGBTQ+ Chamber of Commerce, and Pride in Our Workplace. Next, Lake Jacobs-Skolik, he, him, is a researcher in neural engineering and a recent graduate from Northeastern University. He is the founder and director of Raising Donor Kids, a nonprofit dedicated to providing guidance for same-sex couples interested in gamete donation as a way to grow their family. Being the donor-conceived offspring of a lesbian couple and as a as well as known sperm donor for another lesbian couple, Lake is passionate about equity in the fertility industry. As far as I know, not a well-known sperm donor. Joanna Sheeb, he, she, her, is the research director at the Sperm Bank of California, a nonprofit in Berkeley, California, and psychology professor at University of California, Davis. Her research focuses on donor-assisted family building in the LGBTQ+ and wider donor-assisted communities, as well as on open identity donation at age 18. Longtime collaborators include TSBC Executive Director Alice Ruby and mental health professional Jean Benward. Their findings are used to inform gamete donation practice and policy in the United States and internationally. Finally, Polly Crozier, she, her, is the Director of Family Advocacy at GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders. Polly's work focuses on youth and family issues, including parentage protections, adoption, transgender family law, juvenile justice, and child welfare. Most recently, she has successfully worked to pass statutory family law reforms in Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Maine, and Connecticut, and is working with a coalition to bring parentage law up to date in Massachusetts. Whew, you all are very impressive. I'm going to take a drink while I replenish myself. Okay, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I'm so excited to have all of you here. Again, incredibly impressive resumes, and really excited for us to dive into this conversation. So first, we're going to hear from our donor-conceived individuals tonight. Really excited to hear their stories and get into some conversation with them about their experiences. First up, Kennedy, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself and your story, and then we can talk for a little bit.
Thanks so much, Jordan. I'll keep this super brief. I'm sure it'll come out more with the questions that we'll answer. But my name is Kennedy. I was raised with having two lesbian mothers and a sister who is adopted, younger than me. And I am the product of donor conception. My lesbian mothers are also in an interracial marriage. So my biological mother is Black and Latina, and my other mother, non-biological mother, is white. And my mother specifically chose to use an anonymous donor who also identified as white because it was really important to them that if people were to see my family out and about with my parents separately, that they could see that I was the product of both of my parents. So they wanted to raise their kid to share both of their identities. So they chose an anonymous white male donor from a sperm bank in California. I have never met this person. All I know is his medical history. And I also have no desire to meet this person. And my sister's adopted. So we've had very different experiences, I think, growing up with our relationship with our parents and different conversations. I think I'll probably mention more later about race in our family, because I've obviously had differing relationships with my parents based on my race and how I identify, being someone that is born technically Black and white, but mainly identifying now as just Black and Latina because of how I was raised in this family. So I'll get more into it later, but happy to be here and share my story.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing all of that. I'll go ahead and dive right in. I actually really identify with your perspective on your racial identity. That's a very similar story for me too. And I'm curious, what was that process like for you in really figuring out that identity? And did it have anything to do with, or was it impacted by the fact that you were donor conceived?
Yeah, so I should say too that my sister is also Black and white, and that was also done intentionally so that she would fit into my family, although obviously she has a different experience than mine. But I would say that early on, my family and I had really hard conversations about what that meant. I'm also very light skinned. And so I struggled really early on seeing my Black mother, who is much darker than me, and my abuela, who's much darker than her, and not really knowing how to identify. And I also went to a public school where it was, hard as a kid to be getting asked questions about like, who's your real mom? Because I was kind of in the middle of them in terms of appearance. My one white mom, very white, my other mom Black, and then me kind of in the middle, and my sister kind of in the middle. And her being very open about being adopted. So she kind of didn't get as many questions about her biological makeup. But I would say really early on, I really am grateful for my white mother, because she was very open about, the history of enslavement and letting me know that I was Black, even though I was often, struggling with that and not able to see it as clearly as my Black mother did. He would often try to tell me, you're Black. This is your experience. It's going to be different than a lot of your like white peers. Because I struggled myself having a lot of white friends, not feeling like them, but also not feeling Black. So I think that I really am grateful for my white mom, because she was the one that was, helping me with my Black History Month projects and really trying to, educate my sister and I on where we come from. That also led to difficulties though, like my mom tells a story often of me being like a 5-year-old in the grocery store and saying to my white mom and people that would pass by, like, you killed my people, and not knowing how to reconcile with that, because she would tell me, like, my people were enslaving, Black people, not necessarily her people, but, people that look like her, and trying to explain that to a 5-year-old can be very complicated. So I kind of reconciled with that for a long time. And it wasn't until I was in college and experienced my first, really racist incident as a first year that I finally felt like I was Black. And it was really painful because I had gone through all of high school feeling kind of like, I'm light skinned and not really knowing how to identify between my two parents or to choose a side per se, and being in this more so middle ground. And then finally, when I got into college, experiencing something where I realized, I'm Black, and having to again have those same conversations with my parents. But what I will say, I think, is that I view my white mom as really instrumental in that process, that I think that most people would probably not guess, because they would think that my Black mom was the one who was really trying to hammer that home. But I would say that my white mom was really instrumental in trying to make sure that I felt as though, this race that I was, born into was important, and that I understood my culture, and that I recognized that Blackness early on, despite having, to have many conversations that were difficult, and especially having her not be my biological parent and having to explain to me, those circumstances.
Did you have the same kind of frank conversations about being donor conceived and how your family was formed?
So I actually was just talking to my mom about this tonight, because I do not ever really remember having those conversations, although I was a kid that would often ask hard questions of my parents. But I don't recall that conversation ever as a kid. My parents said that they told me that when I was very young, like probably in elementary school, that like, you don't have a father. And that probably was only because I had kids at school asking me. And I do recall those questions on the playground. I can think of very specific instances of having kids, when I'm getting picked up from school, being like, so which one's your real mom? Where's your dad? Does your mom wonder where your dad is? And having to answer those questions. But I don't ever really remember having that conversation about being donor conceived, or ever really having questions about that. I think I was very comfortable with, this is my family and I have two moms, and I had really no desire to ever know who that person was. And I don't think that had anything really to do with my parents. They never really talked about it, but it also, and to the best of my knowledge, but it wasn't something that I was also like prying to know, or, trying to find out. But they were open about the fact that, like, there is this other part of me. It just wasn't like this, I don't remember having like a sit down conversation, like, this is how you were created. I'm sure they would more so recall that than I would, though, because I was so young.
So it sounds from what you said earlier and what you just said, that this desire, or I should say lack of desire, to have a personal relationship with your gamete provider has really been the story your whole life. Were there ever parts of growing up or in college where that changed or was different in any way?
I think I've had moments, just small moments, where I've wondered, what does this person look like? But they've been very, I would say, when I say brief, I mean seconds. So if you meet my biological mother, people always say, you look just like your mother, you look just like her. And I've grown up always, feeling so proud of that, despite the fact that she's obviously darker than me and I am, this lighter skinned version of her. That's a part that I've always struggled with somewhat, and not knowing, what that other side of me looks like. But I think because people have said, my whole life, like, you and your mom are twins and this is your family, I've never really had this strong desire to find out who this person was. My parents also chose an anonymous donor because they didn't want, me to ever get taken from them, or for some legal action to be taken, with me getting taken from them. And I think growing up, although that wasn't said to me growing up, I understood that. And I understood, that I wanted to be with my parents, and these were my parents. So even now that I could, at the age of 25, find out who this person was, I feel so strongly in that these were my parents. And I don't really care about this person that, for me, in my experience, only donated sperm. I'll never see them as a parent. And my parents also feel very strongly about that. But if I've had thoughts about it, it's been fleeting, to the point of where I think that I would be almost like scared and would never want to go on a website like 23andMe to see, do I have other siblings, or who is this person? Because I think I'm at peace with just never knowing. I don't think there's ever a part of me that will ever have any more than an inkling of curiosity.
If that changes, do you anticipate running into any roadblocks, given the fact that your gamete provider was anonymous?
Certainly. I mean, I don't know to the extent of what my parents know. It seems as if all they really have is medical history. So I think it would be probably hard to track that down, but I think with like, modern technology, you could probably figure that out relatively quickly. If you were to do something like 23andMe or a DNA swab, I feel like you probably could find, at least your siblings and then trace it back to something. But yeah, I think it would be complicated, but I probably would never pursue that route. So I haven't really thought that far ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much for answering those questions and telling us a little bit about yourself. For the audience, just know that we are going to do a Q&A as mentioned before, and so you'll have plenty of time to ask questions toward the end. We'll move on now to Jamie. Hi, Jamie. How are you?
Hi, Jordan. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. Happy early birthday, by the way.
Thank you.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your story?
Sure, thanks. Thanks so much for having me and Kennedy to learn a little bit more about your story, and hello to everyone who joined the call. Jamie, I use she, her pronouns. I live in Boston. I was raised by lesbian parents as well. My parents have been together for 37 years and they got married in 2018, which was a very exciting day for my family. My bio mom used an anonymous donor to have me as a single mom in the early 80s. And at that time, it was her only option. It was the only option that was provided to her by her doctor. And she worked with Fairfax Cryobank to have me and select a donor, an anonymous donor, with the help of her doctor at that time. And then my parents met when I was almost 2 years old, and they got together at that time. And about 8 years later, they decided together to have a second child, again, selecting an anonymous donor with Fairfax Cryobank. My brother and I have different anonymous donors. And at that time, when I was about 8 or 9 years old and they were selecting the donor for my brother, my parents really involved me in that process. And I have a lot of really great and special memories about as a family looking over donor profiles together and having conversations about what that was like. And that was an exciting way for me to be part of my parents' family planning process as a little kid. And those are memories that I cherish. And even before that, my parents had lots of conversations with me about being donor conceived. Kennedy, I really relate to your story in terms of responding to questions being asked of me in school. I grew up in rural upstate New York, and in the 80s and 90s, there were not a lot of out LGBT families, and I was the only person that I knew of at the time in my community that was donor conceived. So I did have a lot of questions, not just from other kids, but parents of kids in my class and also my teachers about my family makeup. And I really feel proud that my parents had the confidence and wits to really educate me about my family, to really factually explain to me what our family makeup was, that I was a donor conceived person, what that meant, how babies were made, how reproduction worked. I had language and understanding in an age appropriate way, to the best that I could understand as a little kid. But I was able to identify parts of my body, parts of the reproductive system on a page in a book as a little kid. And I found that knowledge and just factual understanding of my conception to be a point of empowerment as a little kid in the face of what was often confusion by my friends at school and even sometimes my teachers who, would try to force me to create a Father's Day picture or something, right? And I would say, I don't have a father. I have a grandfather. I could do that, and having to sort of coach people in my community about my story, having that really good information was really useful to me. Yeah, so that's a little bit about my story. I have, to your point, Kennedy, I have done 23andMe or I did Ancestry.com actually a while ago. And that was an interesting experience for me just to see what information was provided. But that wasn't an effort for me necessarily to locate biological relatives, and I didn't actually, there was no one else on my profile that I was biologically related to, but it was interesting just from a um, geographic and ethnic perspective to have a little bit more understanding of my donor's background from that perspective than what was provided to me in the information that my parents got from the Fairfax Cryobank in the 80s.
Can you talk a little bit more about what information was provided versus what you may have wished was provided? I know that currently a lot of the discussion is around open ID donors, for instance, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that and if that might have been a route that you would have preferred.
Yeah, great question. You know, the information that was provided to my mom, again, through her doctor, it's pretty different now where you can just work directly with the cryobanks, right? But at that time, there was an intermediary with her doctor. And so she was only provided really basic medical information and some basics around interests, you know, height, weight, hobbies, education, those kinds of things. And even, you know, a little less than 10 years later, in selecting the donor for my brother, there was a lot more information available. Certainly much more specific medical information and just more information about who this person was as a full person to get a sense of personality, interest traits, things like that. And I do remember, you know, mostly as a teen, sort of feeling like I wish I had more information just about um, mostly an ethnic and geographic perspective. I look pretty different than my bio mom and stand out a little bit from others in my family because of what I look like and stood out in my community. And so because of that, there was sort of this mystery of like, why does my hair look like this? Why does my skin look like this? That my parents couldn't really explain and wasn't provided to me in the information from the cryobank. I think, you know, as I have gone through my journey as a donor conceived person, I do encourage people to consider the perspectives of the donor conceived person and just our ability to select for ourselves what we want to do. And so for that reason, I really do encourage open ID donation where possible and encourage parents in my own community and friends of mine that are family building to select that option. I think it puts the most choice in the donor conceived person's hands. But again, Kennedy, I'm going to pick out something you said. You know, when my parents conceived me in the 80s and my brother in the early 90s, there was real fear about us being taken away and not a lot of information about their rights as parents, especially for my non-bio mom. And even though she second parent adopted both of us, you know, our bio mom had to give up parental rights in New York State and adopt us as well as an LGBT couple. So just the state of LGBT family protections at that time and even still leaves a lot up in the air when it comes to family creation and family legal rights that I completely understand my parents' decision to select an anonymous donor. And had I been in their position, I would have done the same. And I do think that families are considering now what is most safe for their family. And those are really hard choices to make, and there's a lot to weigh.
Thank you for sharing all of that. We're running a little short on your segment, but I do want to ask you another big question. You had mentioned limited medical information, that your brother got more medical information, and I know that that is a particular area of concern for you. And I just want to prompt you by asking, what about that is so important for you specifically?
Yes, thanks, Jordan. That's a great question. So, because I had such limited family medical history on my donor side, as an adult, I pursued medical genetic testing through my doctor and with a genetic counselor. And that was covered by my health insurance, which is a privilege for me to have health insurance for sure. But I encourage all donor conceived people to pursue medical genetic testing. I did find out through that test that I carry the breast cancer gene. And that was really important information for me as a woman in my late 30s to make decisions about my own health care moving forward. What was really interesting about that is at the time that I pursued medical genetic testing, I did so to make up for the missing medical information I had about my donor because I felt really confident about the medical information I had from my mom and on her side of the family. But my own genetic testing prompted my mom and brother to get their testing done. And we actually learned that my mom carries the breast cancer gene and passed it on to me. And so it was an experience for our whole family in that way. And my mom did have breast cancer and beat it, which is great. But this information has been really important to our family to have. And it was being donor conceived that prompted it, but it actually allowed me to fill in gaps in my bio mom's medical history that we didn't have on that side. And I think that's just a really important point of information, right? Like there is missing family medical history regardless of whether you're a donor conceived person or not. My mom is not a donor conceived person and thought she had a really clear picture, but we got this really important information through taking this specific route. So I encourage all donor conceived people, but really all of us to make use of all the medical technology available to us to make up the fullest medical picture so we can make good medical choices for ourselves.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I really appreciate you sharing all of that. We'll come back to you during the Q&A, I'm sure. Lake, hi, how are you?
Jordan, I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. Every time I glance at your square, your light makes it look almost like your hand is raised. And so I keep being like, oh no, I'm missing Lake. No, it's fine. It's fine. Anyway, I would love for you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your family and your story.
So I'm Lake. My parents are lesbians. I was born in 1998 in technically Ohio because the hospitals around there were better, and both of my parents are physicians, so they were acutely aware of that. But raised in Huntington, West Virginia for the first 12 years of my life. And then we moved to Weston, Connecticut, and then I moved to Boston for college and been here since. Growing up with two moms was, especially in Huntington, West Virginia, was interesting because I'm also Jewish. So being a Jewish family with two moms in a very deeply red state was interesting. It presented some problems sometimes. I remember growing up, well, I guess this I don't remember, but I learned about afterwards. There was some real difficulty because my non-biological mom was the breadwinner of the household, and she was the one who had insurance through her office. And it was a real battle, but thankfully they were able to sort out to get my, at that time, brother, now sister. I have two sisters, one of whom is trans. I apologize. I'm rambling a little bit. Everybody else on the panel has some type of job where they have to write a lot and are very educated. And I'm an engineer by training, so I can like barely read.
You're doing just fine, Lake.
Yeah, but it was interesting. Then when we moved to Connecticut, my other mom was able to go through the second parent adoption process with us. The sperm donor that used to conceive us was anonymous, and the same for myself and both of my sisters. I actually ended up meeting the guy a couple years back because not even thinking about meeting people, like I wasn't even aware that 23andMe had that functionality. I did a 23andMe test just because I was like, oh, why not get some stuff tested? Could be good to know. I met one of my half siblings, and then another, and then another. And it turns out there are 27 of us. So that was a cool experience. through one of them, I ended up meeting the sperm donor. He was a very interesting guy. It turns out that he's also a physician, and both he and my biological mother are in the same, not only specialty, but the same subspecialty. They're both child psychiatrists, which is interesting, especially because my other mother is a retinal surgeon and I'm now headed off to med school, ostensibly.
So it runs through multiple generations.
Yeah, coming at me from 3 directions.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that, Lake. I really appreciate it. I wanted to first ask you, what was it like growing up with the situation that you explained where you were with your moms, but one of them had not adopted you? Were you cognizant of the legal precariousness? Is that a word? Precarity, that's the word. The legal precarity of that situation?
I really wasn't at all. I grew up feeling like, this is just my family. I felt very loved and like I had 2 parents who cared for me a lot, because that was the case. Like both of my parents were very, very active in fighting for me to get the best education I could, because in the area we were in West Virginia, the public school system was not fantastic. So they were both very, very involved with whatever school I was at. And it just felt like these are my parents. None of the legal precarity or insecurity around technicalities around things really got to me. I have just always been very, very secure in that relationship. My parents, I don't remember this, but they love to tell the story of when I was on the playground in 1st grade and a kid came up to us and asked, how were you made if you need a boy and a girl to make a baby? And I said, you don't, you just need a sperm and an egg, because they had already explained that whole process to me, and that, you have 2 haploid cells that come together to form a zygote, which is the fertilized egg, and then that grows. So a love for science was kind of determined from a very early age, and that's where they came from with explaining all of it. So like Kennedy said, I don't remember a time where I didn't know I was donor conceived. It was just always information that was out there. And I think that really, really helped, not having it treated like a secret or like it was something that could threaten our family structure.
Yeah, I know that you're really passionate about this and went on to actually found an organization. I'd love for you to tell us about the organization, Raising Donor Kids, and why you created it.
Yeah, so about like 2 years ago now, a little less than that, I kept getting ads actually from Fairfax Cryobank, which is the cryobank that my parents used to conceive me, to donate sperm. But under FDA regulations, men who have sex with men in the US can't donate sperm. And that, upset my sense of justice a little bit. And I'm like, I saw how much of a great thing it was for my family. I want to pay this favor forward. I really have no major health conditions. It seems like I would be a good candidate, but I can't because I'm gay. That doesn't make sense to me. So I ended up signing up with this matching service and meeting this couple who asked me to donate sperm. I became fantastic friends with them throughout the process. We decided together, I think after the baby was born, that they're going to call me Uncle Lake, and just be very open with that. But I noticed throughout the process that a lot of the fertility industry and the parenting industry, honestly, like advice out there for parents, choosing school systems, etc., can be really hostile to same-sex parents at times, which surprised me, especially about the fertility industry, because the majority of people pursuing gamete donation are same-sex couples. So I decided, there's got to be something we can do about this. And I thought that something very, very impactful, especially for providing guidance for those same-sex couples who might have questions about the whole process and what the implications are for the kid that they have, could be to interview people who are donor-conceived children of same-sex parents on what their relationship was like with their parents growing up, how their parents broached the topic, because it's a very, very different question than straight parents have to answer.
Can you say more about that? In fact, on our last webinar, there was a question that I think was really asking about that, like, why do you perceive there to be a difference between donor-conceived people with straight parents and donor-conceived people with queer parents? The wording of it kind of tripped us up a little bit, and so I don't quite think it was made that explicit. But since you brought it up, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'll say, because the language can be tricky there, I don't think there's a difference between the people. I think there's a difference between the questions that have to be answered by the parents, because if you're a same-sex couple, inevitably the question is going to come up with your kid, usually at a really young age. How did they get here? If you're a straight couple, it's just kind of assumed. So if you don't actively talk about it, there's a possibility that it gets swept under the rug and just assumed until your kid is at such an age that either they put together, hey, both of your eyes are blue and mine are brown, or they have genetic testing done or something like that. And, you know, if you've thought that your family was structured one way all throughout your life, maybe you've invested some idea or you've developed the idea on some level that genetics equals family, that can be a pretty earth-shattering realization. But for gay couples speaking with their kids about this, that's never really on the radar because you have to tell them. So the question is not when do I tell them, it's how do we discuss it as a family? At what age will this come up? And then there are additional questions that non-bio parents have. Am I going to have a harder time bonding with my kid? Will I still have that, if it's two women, will I still have that maternal link? If it's two men, will I still have that paternal link? Is there going to be any difference there? How do we divide up the typical parenting responsibilities when our marriage doesn't fall along gender roles? There's no reason that child rearing should. And so it's just a different set of questions that same-sex parents have to answer. And I wanted to make sure there was a resource out there where they could get those answers in a really honest, non-biased sense.
Yeah. Well, we'll be very happy to help you find some correspondence for you to work with, and look forward to amplifying the rest of the work that you're doing. So before we get to our Q&A, we did want to invite two of our friends in to briefly discuss some of the research as well as some of the legislative work that's going on around these issues. First up, Joanna, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, and feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Jordan. First, I want to actually thank Kennedy, Jamie, and Lake for sharing your stories. It's always wonderful, given that I'm a researcher, it's always amazing for me to hear whole stories rather than people completing rating scales. I think tonight you'll hear some overlap with the kinds of findings that we've had at the Sperm Bank of California. So to introduce myself, I'm Joanna Shab. I identify as she, her. I'm a researcher primarily, and a professor from UC Davis, and I also direct the research at the Sperm Bank of California, which I'll be calling TSBC. I also want to thank COLAGE, Jordan, and GLAD for giving me time to share some of this research. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to share my screen. We'll see if that works. I only have one slide, you'll be relieved to know. I've been disabled from screen sharing, but I can just talk. Maybe it'll come back. So to set some context, TSBC was actually created in 1982 for some of the reasons that Lake has been talking about. It was created in 1982 to serve the queer community who were not being served elsewhere. And it remains the only nonprofit sperm bank in the US. A big part of what TSBC does, besides helping people have children, is to listen to the families and to the donors. And this guides the programs that TSBC provides and what kind of research is done. Since the 80s, and I have not been there since the 80s, TSBC has collaborated with researchers to look at how the families are doing and if the programs are working. I'm quite grateful that so many people have been willing to share their experiences in our research, and of course, through feedback to TSBC. Today, I'm going to focus on 3 research questions, specifically what was in my slide was
I think you should be able to share now, Joanna. Sorry.
Okay. Does that seem to work?
You're set. You're good.
Okay, very good. Okay, so today I'm going to focus on 3 research questions, specifically, how are the families doing? And my focus today will be on the donor-conceived people. How do donor-conceived people, specifically at TSBC, feel about having donor origins? And what's the extent of people's interest in the donor? And here I'm focused on donor-conceived people's interest. So in terms of the first question, how are the donor-conceived people doing? Charlotte Patterson and her team at the University of Virginia were actually the first to ask how sperm donor-conceived children were doing in non-traditional families. Specifically, they were interested in the children's psychological adjustment. The team, along with then Executive Director Barber-Fraser, asked this question in a sample of 80 families who had TSBC donors. And the interesting thing about this sperm bank is that any family could join regardless of relationship status or sexual orientation. So the parent, and there's a whole bunch of other things too, but the focus here was that in this sample, the parents were either coupled, partnered, or single, and they identified as either heterosexual or, at the time, they said lesbian, but I'll be using the word queer. Their children at the time were between the ages of 5 and 10, on average about 7. So their findings, first, they found that overall the children were developing normally. None of them showed unusual behavioral problems, and they were well adjusted. I don't think that should be a surprise to many of you today. Second, they actually found no differences based on family type. That is, child well-being was not related to whether a child had one parent or 2, or whether the parents identified as queer or heterosexual. There was variation in child adjustment level, though, and it was within the range of normal. Well, it was in the normal range of well-being. What these researchers found was that this variation was actually related to things that were going on in the family, not to what kind of family they had. Specifically, when the parents reported more parental stress or conflict with their spouses, there were also lower adjustment levels in the children. Or, to say it another way, when parents reported lower parenting stress, which we all want, greater spousal relationship quality, and satisfaction with the parental division of labor, the kids did best. So the focus moved away slowly over the years from looking at things like the structure of the family to starting to look at psychological processes within the families. So going beyond I should say that these original findings have been replicated by other researchers who have used other measures and who have looked in populations both in the US and internationally. It's well replicated. So going beyond the children, studies have also found similar well-being in teenagers. And I'm going to focus here specifically on female same-sex couples in adults. So when we look at the adjustment and in teens and young adults, the best studies to look at have been done by Nanette Gartrell and her colleagues in the US National Longitudinal Lesbian Family Study. And what they have found is that teens and adults up to the age of 25 who were conceived with sperm donor assistance and queer families, lesbian queer families as a whole, are doing well. So what about the donors in these families? In these studies that have been replicated and in the National Longitudinal Lesbian Family Study, the donor-conceived people most often had known donors or anonymous donors from sperm banks, and smaller numbers had what we call open identity donors at age 18, which means that the donor can be identified if a donor-conceived person wants when they reach the age of 18. So with this background on how the families and the donor-conceived people were doing, the research questions that I focused on most is interest in the donor and how people feel about having donor organs. In addition, most of my work, the majority of my participants of TSBC families are queer identified, but it is important to know that there are smaller numbers of heterosexual couple families and single parent families. And this is not common in studies. So the TSBC research team first asked these kinds of questions in teenagers aged 12 to 17 who had specifically open identity donors. The sample included donor-conceived people from equal numbers of two-mom families and at the time single mom families, and a smaller number from heterosexual couple families. It's important to note that this study was part of a larger study that included donors as well as parents. But the teens completed a questionnaire on their own, and the overall response rate for the teens was 60%. So in this sample, obviously, they're not going to be asked to be in a sample if they don't know about their origins, but in this group of people, all the teens knew about having donor organs. And most, as we've heard earlier from our other speakers, reported that they had always known, even among the heterosexual couples, which is very unlike what you see in studies from elsewhere. When we asked about the effects of learning on the relationship with their parents, all but one said it had no effect or a positive effect. And they did, most of them, keep in mind, learn very, very early on. The people who had always known were more likely to say that learning had no effect at all. When we then asked them about their comfort with having donor origins. Here we were using a rating scale, and most rated themselves as somewhat to very comfortable, and all but two felt at least neutral about it. The two teens who felt moderately uncomfortable, and this is what we've heard elsewhere, they reported that they felt unique or different, but in a negative way. And that was often because of people's questions at school and whatnot. The other 90% who felt at least neutral or otherwise or more positive said that their comfort came from feeling very wanted or unique in a positive way, which is something you hear very often in heterosexual couple families. So we were hearing it here too. But we also heard many of them, about half of them also said that it didn't affect their life. It was all they knew. So often they would say it's just kind of a neutral thing, but there were other things that were more important. So this sample of donor-conceived teens had open identities, and we asked them about their interest in the donor and about plans to get the donor's identity. And what we heard were most were curious about the donor, though we did have a smaller proportion of them who said they hadn't really thought about it or didn't care. And there was one person who was resentful for not knowing the donor. Most wanted to know what the donor was like as a person, and some wanted to know if they shared similarities. In terms of plans to get the donor's identity, all but one planned to do so, half at age 18 and half weren't sure when. And if we flash forward, many of these folks have gone on to make a request, but not all of them. And similar to more recent studies, we also found that almost as many of the teens reported being moderately to very interested in contacting people who shared their donor. And finally, when we looked at the relationship between how comfortable they felt about their origins and being interested in the donor, there was no relation. And this has been found in studies outside TSBC as well. Most currently, we're doing research with adults. And as one measure of interest in the donor, we looked at their requests for TSBC donor identities over a 10-year time span, so from 2001 to 2011. And it's important to note that during that time period, coming to TSBC would have been the easiest way to get the donor's identity because DNA testing wasn't easily accessible. And unlike other studies, we could also determine the extent of interest because we knew how many people were eligible, so people from 256 families, and we found that 85 actually made a request. This translates to about a third of the people who were eligible actually made a request. And as you can guess, some of the heterosexual couple children wouldn't have known about having this option or even how they were conceived. They were a very small number on the sample. But if you consider that, the requesting rate is probably closer to 40%. So a sizable proportion of donor-conceived adults who are both eligible and knew about their origins, about 2 out of every 5 people, requested the donor's identity in this first 10-year time period. And many did so soon after becoming eligible between ages 18 and 21. In our most recent follow-up study with adults, we've been interviewing them, and we've learned that 80% have gone on to contact the donor. We've also found that they have as much interest in people who share the donor as in the donor himself. And they have explained that they share important connections, both through similarities through the donor, but as well as finding people who share their unique experiences of being donor conceived. And this is a major reason why COLAGE is such an important organization for families to help with these connections. And I should also note that when the adults described their experiences, half explained that it was actually easier to relate to someone their own age as compared to the donor. So let me wrap up for you. Move along. Here we are. We find that in TSBC families, the research indicates that the children are doing well, and that most of the parents are telling their children at an early age that the donor helped their family. And this includes higher than typical numbers of heterosexual couple parents. That's an important thing to know. The teens were, for the most part, comfortable with having donor organs, and yet they were still interested in donor information. That's an important thing. And among the group of adults, a sizable minority got the donor's identity and contacted the donor, most often soon after they were eligible. And we do anticipate that more will make requests at later life stages, like when they have kids, though so far I should say a few have made later requests. But also there are people who are less interested in the donor. And you might say, how do we know? Well, first, if you remember in that teen study, there were a good number of people who didn't participate. The response rate was 60%. And it wasn't because they didn't know about their origins. We knew from the parent study that almost all of them had been told. Instead, they had just opted not to or weren't interested. Second, or it wasn't a priority. Second, parents also often contact us about questions about the identity release program because they're trying to support their teens to prepare to get the donor's identity. And then when the donor conceived person turns 18, they don't make a request. And then we've also found that some of the teens who said they were likely to get the donor's identity, when they actually became eligible, they didn't make a request. They're probably still interested, but from feedback, it's a lower priority. So overall, a key finding is that a significant number of people are interested enough that they get donor information, but it's really important that we learn from donor-conceived people who haven't expressed that much interest, who have not made donor identity requests. And if you're interested in any of this, the studies are at that link at the Sperm Bank's website. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanna. Really appreciate you sharing all of that information with us. And also apologies for mispronouncing your last name earlier. I feel like I have to do that.
Not to worry. Not to worry.
Okay. Thank you again. Polly, would you mind sharing with us some legal and legislative updates? Also, Joanna, you are still sharing your screen.
Of course, it is so great to be with you all here tonight. And so great to hear the panelists' experiences. And also as a lawyer to hear kind of one of the common threads I heard was your parents' worries about legal security for your family. And so I'm grateful to be able to be here briefly to talk about legal security issues for LGBTQ families and their children. Also just want to say I feel incredibly grateful to collaborate with COLAGE as well as other LGBTQ movement organizations like the National Center for Lesbian Rights and Family Equality. Some folks who really are working hard to protect LGBTQ families and their children across the United States. I think this work has always been important, and I think it's even more important now, given the national context that we're all living in. And so I'll talk really briefly about that context that many of you are probably very well aware of, unfortunately, which is, I think for many children of LGBTQ families and LGBTQ families, it can be a very hard time to be living in this current climate, right? When we have US Supreme Court justices who have signaled wanting to kind of upend the right to marry, upend the right to LGBTQ intimacy. Already in this young state legislative session, over 150 bills have been filed that are anti-LGBTQ or anti-trans across the US. There are extremists who are working in communities across the country to ban books in libraries, to strip curriculums in classrooms or policies that are LGBTQ inclusive or have LGBTQ content. And I think this context just kind of threatens to exacerbate what we already know about existing societal homophobia and transphobia, and makes people feel afraid. And also there are truly existing holes in protections for children and families. And so I want to talk briefly about what some of those holes are. I think, unfortunately, the United States remains a place where there's a patchwork of protections for children born to LGBTQ families. Some states, like from Maine to Washington State, in some of those states, there are comprehensive protections for children, regardless of the sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status of their parents, or the circumstances of their birth through assisted reproduction or surrogacy. But in many states, there are very limited protections for LGBTQ parent-child relationships, and not enough paths to protect those relationships. And since many of you are LGBTQ parents or children of LGBTQ parents, I want to share some about the ongoing work to fill those holes so that all children are protected, all children in every family. And because legal parentage is that legal relationship between a parent and a child from which every single right and responsibility flows, right? I think Lake talked a little bit about the health insurance and the ability to access health insurance, right? It's health insurance, decision-making, child custody, inheritance rights, the ability to travel. It is, parentage is really important for the daily operation and ability to thrive in your life and in your communities. And it's incredibly important for kind of child well-being across their lifetimes. So a few highlights of what's happening, some of the good news, because there is good news. In the past 6 years, a number of states have comprehensively updated their parentage protections to ensure all children have access to the security of legal parent-child relationship. Some of those states include Washington State, California, Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island, and most recently this summer, Colorado. And I think, work is ongoing in state legislatures to expand protections for LGBTQ families, and a number of groups, GLAAD, COLAGE, NCLR, Family Equality, and others are working incredibly hard to support states in making those changes. And I want to say to anybody who's working locally in their state or connected to efforts, please reach out to GLAAD, to any one of these groups, so that we can support you in that work. We do a lot of thinking about how to support individual states and what's right for that state and how we can build protections, because some states can do it inch by inch, some states can do it all at once, and we want to do whatever we can to support children and families. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that's happening in my home state of Massachusetts, which, it might surprise a lot of folks that in the birthplace of marriage equality in the United States, we still do not have parentage equality. And, to remember that for the LGBTQ families, those things are really different, right? Whether you can marry, you still have to protect your parent-child relationship, particularly from discrimination and being able to travel freely. So we have a coalition, the Massachusetts Parentage Act Coalition, 45 organizations, so many children and families working to update Massachusetts laws, which are currently 40 years old. They have no protections for children born through surrogacy, very few protections for children born through assisted reproduction, no clarity on donor legal status, And then, the statutes are gendered and simply not inclusive of many families. We recently refiled the bills, just started a new legislative session to update the law, and we're incredibly hopeful. And I think this is just, one example of, in many states, there's a phenomenal opportunity to get involved locally, share your story, and contact your legislature, your legislative representatives to make the change that you want to see. We have a phenomenal collager in Massachusetts who often speaks at rallies and events and tells his story of how he's 18 and how the law hasn't changed since he was born, and how the struggles his fathers went through to protect him, and how those same struggles are still happening today. He's such an incredible advocate for law reform, and just really grateful for his advocacy, and many of the children and adults in our coalition who are working every day to make that change happen. So in any event, there is still patchwork, but I think let's all work together in improving the situation, because clearly I think security for our families is really an important, it's something we all live with and think about every day. So again, thank you for having me. Thank you to all the collagers for all of your collaboration and work. I think these kind of events really help build understanding about our children and families. It's incredibly invaluable. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all that information, Polly, and we're so appreciative for all the work that you and GLAAD do on behalf of our families and our broader community as well. Thank you very much. So we are going to enter into Q&A. We planned on going until about 9:15. If folks can hang in a little bit longer than that, there are plenty of questions, but we'll see what we can get through in the amount of time that we had planned, and see if we'll go over it all. Anyway, let's begin. First, Lake, you were asked to clarify the name of your organization, and so I'd love for you to do that right at the top.
So it's called Raising Donor Kids. Right now, you're not going to find a lot on it because it's very new and the website is as of yet unpublished. I've done a good number of interviews so far. I think we have like 6. And another thing that we're doing is collecting resources so parents can just navigate fertility law in their states. But right now the website is very, very bare bones, not very pretty. And so I'm waiting to clean it up a little bit before I hit the publish button.
Okay. Well, we'll certainly be able to send information about that when it comes. So whoever asked that question, feel free to sign up for the Collage listserv, and I'm sure you'll hear about it. Okay, this is for all of the panelists. Do you feel that being donor conceived and or having queer parents has benefited you in any way? If so, how?
I think having queer parents is the reason why I decided to go to law school. It's the reason why I do the work that I do, because growing up, I was living in a time when there wasn't Obergefell, there wasn't Windsor. And so I felt, very insecure about my family in the sense of proud of where I came from, but insecure of what could happen to me or my sister, and insecure about my parents not being, legally married. And it wasn't until I think the day after I graduated from high school that Obergefell came down, and I got to see my parents become legally married before that, but for everyone to have that same equal right. And it really pushed me to want to be a lawyer, to be able to fight for these things. And so I wouldn't say that my identity is so much encompassing of being donor conceived, but I think that being a queer spawn, and also being Black and Latina and having all those identities that we had to discuss constantly in my household because I was donor conceived and had those intertwining identities, it really pushed me to want to advocate and help other people, and also for people to have an advocate who had experienced that. I think it's important, obviously, for lawyers to be allies who don't have same experiences, but the reason why I really wanted to be a lawyer was to be able to bring this perspective into the room and to be able to fight for people who I could understand, because I think it goes, beyond allyship, and it can be even more powerful when your representative has had similar experiences to you when you're trying to fight for equality under the law. And we're clearly still fighting for it because, as Polly mentioned earlier, Obergefell could be at some point, unfortunately, reversed.
Kennedy, I really relate to that. I often say that being part of an LGBT family is part of the reason that I do equity and inclusion work professionally as an adult, and I'm a social justice advocate. But from the perspective of being a donor conceived person, I really feel like being a donor conceived person has benefited me in my own identity development because so many questions came from the society around me. It forced me to really be able to be confident and firm in how I feel and really explore who I am internally. I certainly had a support system in my parents to help me ask questions about who I am, understand who I am, but I really appreciated the um, openness that they let me explore who I am. And I think, it's as a result of homophobia, and it's as a result of heterosexism that I was forced to kind of, speed up my identity development, so to speak. But I really, as an adult in retrospect, feel really grateful for that experience, because I think my deep reflection and thinking about who I am, who my family is, and how I want to speak about, live as a part of this society and community, all of that really has helped me to be a confident and grounded person and adult. And I find in conversations with other folks who maybe weren't forced, so to speak, to have to answer these identity questions for themselves as young people, that they're struggling with that now as an adult, where I've been doing that my whole life, right? So I find that to be a real advantage just as an adult in the world, trying to navigate through the same stuff as everybody else.
My answer to this question is probably a little bit different. And it's that being donor conceived, I think, played much less into my identity than who my parents are. Both of them were such fantastic role models for me growing up. And I can think of so many examples of, the way that they were and the opportunities that they allowed me to have shaping who I am as a person now, that it really outweighs anything that I can track directly to being donor conceived. Like, I think in terms of emotional impact over the course of my life, my parents worried about it more than I did. They always gave, great answers whenever I had questions. And so I just never felt like it was anything other than mundane and how I was.
Thank you all. Polly, we have a question for you. Can you give any examples of the kinds of protections people might not realize they do not have?
Yeah, let me do my best. Well, I think, Lake had a good example. I mean, it clearly didn't impact him on a social emotional level, but to the extent that you live in a state where there is no path to protection, like if you're, say, an unmarried LGBTQ couple and you can't adopt your child, when one parent is has a legal relationship, like if let's say a person gives birth to a child, they're generally considered to be their legal parent, right? And then they're partnered with a non-biological parent who has no legal relationship with them, right? Because usually in states without comprehensive protections, people are protected to their parents through birth or through genetic connection, right? That's many state laws kind of default to those two things, which which protects many people, right? But it's for those particularly non-biological parents where many states lack those protections, right? But let's say a state like Maine that has updated its parentage laws. So you can be protected in Maine if you are a parent through assisted reproduction, if you're a parent of a child born through surrogacy, if you are a non-marital parent and you hold a child out as your parent for a specific period of time and you act as a parent, you can be a legal parent in some states, right? So what we want to make sure families have is paths to parentage, no matter kind of how children are born or the makeup of their families. Because that's what really, there's so much diversity in how our families are built, every family across every community. And we want to make sure that every family has the ability to protect themselves. Because again, when one parent has a legal relationship and the other parent does not, it sets up a child to be vulnerable, right? Let's say a child is removed by the child welfare system, right? And the non-biological parent doesn't necessarily have a legal relationship and can't be a resource for that child, can't be a foster parent, is essentially a legal stranger, right? I represented a number of people who's have not had a legal relationship with their child, and when the adult relationship breaks up, the legal parent will, take a child to another state, separate the child from their other parent, right? So many of these protections are really about making sure the child is secure in their relationships with the people who have loved and cared for them. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Polly. I think you did. The next question is, as donor conceived people, do you have any thoughts on family limits or donors? And there was also a question about feelings on having siblings with a different donor. And Kennedy, I guess you could answer that if you would like to, from the perspective of having an adopted sister.
I'm sorry, what do you mean in terms of my sister and me?
If you wanted to answer the question was phrased as, how do you feel about having a sibling that has a different donor than you? But I would imagine that you may have a thought as someone who has an adopted sibling.
Yeah. I don't think it's ever, I've definitely always known my sister was adopted. I was 5 years old and she was 3. And I remember my parents asking me, specifically like do I want a brother or a sister? And I wanted a sister, but I remember being like, I want a baby. And then they brought her and she was 3. And I was like, no, not her. And just remember being, because I, as a 5-year-old, I wanted to hold this little like bitty baby and she was like my same size. And I was like, this is not what I meant. And I'm grateful now to have had someone so close in age. I think it was a lot better, but I don't think it really ever impacted our relationship in any way that she was different. I especially think that is that way because she was also biracial. She was also Black and white. And so we shared the same, race. We went through the same issues of exploring our race. And we also had the same parents. And because one of my parents was obviously not biologically related to me, we had that same issue. So I think that there were issues in terms of the fact that my mom was my biological mother, and I did know who that was my whole life, and she never knew that. But we never really had conversations, and we still don't have conversations now about our relationship or seeing each other any differently than a family, because she doesn't know her parents and I know one of mine. I think we just have always seen it as this is our family, and this is what it is, and not really, having questions, but not questioning who we are, where we come from, and whether or not, my white mom is my real mom, because to us, it's always been our real parents. And I think the situation is a lot better that she's in our family than where she could have been in the alternative. But I think that's just the way it is.
I can answer that question too, Jordan. My brother and I have different donors, and I had mentioned that my parents chose to have my brother when I was almost 9 years old, and my parents did ask the cryobank if my same donor was available, and he had no more sample left, or I don't know what the story was, but he was not an option, so they went with another donor. In terms of our relationship, it has had no impact at all. My brother is my brother and my parents are my parents, and our family is really, firm in our structure. And, I do remember at one point being in a conversation with someone, and they referred to my brother as my half brother. And both my brother and I were like really confused at first, and then had a really visceral reaction because we had never heard that or thought of that before. And then we had to sort of do the mental gymnastics to think about the person's frame of mind coming just from a genetic relative perspective, which is not how our family was created or formed or exists in the world. And it was really harmful, actually, to me at that time, to say, oh my gosh, do people see us as half siblings? What a strange concept. What does that even mean? We're full siblings in every sense of the word, and we share some different genetic material, and we share some similar genetic material, and we have conversations about that and talk about it, and we look different, but it's another way that we're different, just like he's very sporty and I'm really not, right? So it's part of who we are in our story, but it's not a defining feature of our relationship in any way.
Thank you. Another question, some of you have mentioned that your parents have strong feelings about the donor and their role or lack thereof in your family. Can you elaborate on their feelings, and how do you think this has impacted your feelings about the donor?
I can speak to that. My parents have always had strong feelings in the sense of they did not want someone coming into our family and disrupting that dynamic and or taking me away from them in any kind of legal manner. That was never really said to me until I started having questions about that going to law school. I never really ever like thought about that. We never really discussed that. I think for me personally, I grew up in this household of all women, which is a very unique experience, and it was very empowering. So I've never felt as though my parents' beliefs have to be my own. In fact, I think they would tell you that I'm very independent and strong-willed and will believe what I want to believe, and no one's going to tell me differently. Whether or not my parents believe that's a different story, and just because we have the same beliefs doesn't mean anything. But I think now, having gone through law school, having taken courses like trust and estates, studied family law for the bar, I'm very grateful that they felt that way and put up all those protections, being their doctor, so being non-lawyers, taking the route to have done that. We were one of the first families in my where I grew up in my town to have gone through this process and had second parent adoption and done what we did. And I'm so very grateful that they decided to keep it anonymous and have all these protections with lawyers to make sure this never happened where I was taken away. Because I think that we're always in this precarious state with LGBTQ families and the possibility of that even now. So I didn't start having those questions until I started, taking these courses and thinking about, why did you guys decide to do this? Or what could have happened if so-and-so died? Or what could have happened if you got a divorce? Could you have taken me to a different state? Yada, yada. But so looking back, I'm very grateful for that, but I don't think that my opinions came from my parents. And I think that I feel that way because of how I was raised in this family and how closely I feel to my own parents. And I wouldn't, even now, even the fact that I'm 25, would still not want to contact that donor because of how close I feel to my family. And my identity that I've grown into. It's also the fact that I was raised to be Black and Latina, and I do not feel like I'm white. So I don't feel this need to find out the white side of my family from what I have already heard from my white mom, right? So I think there's also that too. It might be different if my donor was, Black or some other minority identity. I might feel, wanting to learn more about that culture. But for me, I feel very strongly in how my parents raised me, as Jamie was saying earlier, that I don't ever feel a need to contact that person or feel as though, any differently than my parents do because of the situation I've been in.
I'll just add to say my parents felt really strongly that the power and decision making was in my hands. So I remember being in my 20s and asking my parents, like, do you think I should look for donor siblings? I had read an article about someone who found many donor siblings and said, do you think this is something I should do? And I remember my parents saying, we can't decide for you. This is your journey. It's your story. You really need to own it, and we can talk through it with you. But this is your journey to navigate, and we're here for support. And that was really their stance on it. And I think that did influence me for sure to really think long and hard about how I felt and what my identity was around being donor conceived or not, and what I wanted to do or not, and be firm in where those feelings were coming from and explore them for myself.
Lake, how was that process for you? You mentioned finding a lot of donor siblings. What was that like for you? And did it have any impact on your relationships inside of your family?
So I don't think it had any impact on my relationships inside of my family at all. They all kind of came to it with the same mindset that I did, that, oh, that's pretty cool. That's neat to find out where that came from. Like one specific trait that I remember talking about was, as a kid on family road trips, I could never drink any water, or else we would have to pull over to pee every 15 minutes. And then when I meet my sperm donor for the first time, it's like 20 minutes into we're going out for coffee. And it's the second time he's gone to the bathroom. And then he does it again like 7 minutes later. I'm like, you did this to me. You're the reason why family road trip fluid tell. Jokingly, of course. But it was just neat to figure out where that came from. And so when I told my parents, they're like, that's where it came from. And it was just overall kind of a fun, lighthearted experience. It didn't feel like anything life-changing or world-shattering for me. I will say that wasn't necessarily the case for some of the other half siblings I met who had mostly been raised by straight parents. Some of them, it was very kind of earth-shattering for them because they didn't know before they did 23andMe, or it had always been kind of a hush-hush topic. But honestly, because we were all so secure in our familial relations, even I'll add the fact that at that point, my parents were already separated. They're divorced now. Even throughout that, we've just all been always so confident that we are a family, and it really doesn't matter that the gender makeup of that family is a lot different from a lot of other families. That meeting all of those half siblings, meeting the donor, was more of a fun little intellectual way to probe curiosities than anything else. It wasn't really emotionally impactful in any negative way.
Okay, well, thank you all for sharing. I'm going to ask one more question. We're like over. So apologies. And thank you so much, by the way, to the GLAD technical team for really propping us up this evening and keeping the grills, I almost said the grills weast because I do that verbal dyslexic thing. The wheels greased behind the scenes. So thank you very much. Okay, final question, and it's a total softball. What would you like people to know about the experiences of people with donor conceived? I'm so sorry, people with LGBTQ parents who are donor conceived, just generally, what do you think people should know that they don't already know, or that they might think that they know?
I guess I'll go first. And I guess what I would want people to know is that the individual parents that you grow up with are going to have a much, much larger impact on how you turn out and your feelings about things than the fact that you're donor conceived. It's just another way to make a family. There are a bunch of them. And what really defines a family is the work and the love you put in, not the genetic relatedness. It's something flashy that it's easy to focus on. I mean, there's evidently enough interest that I have a nonprofit around it and we're doing a panel on it. But really, at the end of the day, it's just not as impactful as the work and the love you put in with your family.
I think going off of that, I'm very grateful to have had the sperm donor that made it possible for my moms to have me. My other mom initially, who's 10 years younger than my birth mother, tried to conceive and was unable to get pregnant. And so the only other way that they were going to be able to have a child be biologically related to either of them was for my 40-year-old, well, 39 at the time, year old mother to get pregnant. And she did with me on the first time. So I'm very grateful to have that sperm donor, who's the reason why I'm here and the reason why my parents are able to have a child who looks like one of them. At the same time, though, I wish that more people, and I guess mainly kids, but people in general knew that that is not your father. It does not make a parent. My parents and I have had discussions recently, like, your parent is who raised you, I think is like was trying to say, was saying. And I think that that is, to me, more important than some person that, although through the goodness of their heart donated sperm, not everybody who is the recipient of that wants to then have a relationship. And there are some people that do, and I'm really grateful that there are people that want to have that, but not everyone that is a product of that is wondering, wanting to answer those questions, like, who's your real dad, or who's your real parent? Do you care about your dad? Do you want to know what you look like? Those questions. As a kid, I felt very uncomfortable. And obviously now it's a lot easier to answer them. But I wish, growing up that, kids like me don't have to go through that, or don't have to answer those questions, or, people were just more understanding that there are those kids that want to know those things and there are those kids that don't. And I think both points of view are perfectly okay. But just also having that space for those that don't or aren't curious to feel comfortable and confident in that situation, and that in those answers, because my sperm donor, I don't think of him as my dad or my father. He's just a sperm donor who's a great person, I'm sure. But my mom, who is my non-biological mother, is just as much my mother as the one that gave birth to me. And I also probably wouldn't be here without my non-biological mother, who really wanted to have me too, in addition to my biological mother.
I'll pile on to that and just say that I think it's really important for people to know about LGBT parented families with donor conceived youth or people as part of their families, that there is such a wide spectrum of experiences. And I think it's really important for donor conceived people with queer parents to be part of the national conversation and decision making around legislation that impacts donor conceived people and the possibilities for family formation moving forward. Being a part of lots of these discussions in a lot of different platforms, there does seem to be a national narrative in some ways that aims to limit the ways that people can create families through donors or through surrogacy, and also is I think puts at risk minors in LGBT families by pursuing some legislation that I know some other countries have pursued related to releasing donor ID before age 18, or doing Ancestry.com or 23andMe tests on youth under age 18. I really think that we should all be given the opportunity to pursue our own options when we're adults as donor conceived people, as opposed to having our parents make those decisions for us, especially in such a precarious legal situation that we have in the United States for LGBT families, a patchwork of protections for our families, as Polly said. So I think the conversation is really nuanced and there's a broad spectrum of our perspectives. And I hope more LGBT parented families and kids in LGBT families become part of the national conversation in a real way.
I think that was the perfect way to end this evening. I want to thank all of you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate all of your perspectives. Thank you especially Jamie and Lake and Kennedy for talking about yourselves. I know how difficult that can be sometimes, and doing it to a group of total strangers and you can't see their faces often is nerve-wracking. So I appreciate you really being willing to share. And thank you again, Polly and Glad, for all the work that you're doing. Joanna and TSBC for really supporting our families for so long. I'm grateful to all of you. I look forward to continuing these conversations, and we'll be back with more news around donor conceived people with LGBTQ parents in the future. In the meantime, you can check out more information at collage.org. We actually just published our updated guide for people with donor, I'm sorry, I keep saying that. For people who are donor conceived with LGBTQ parents, we'll be promoting that more rigorously in the future, but you all are the first to know that it's up there and it's live. So feel free to check that out. And again, we'll see you all in the future. Thank you so much.